It is the winter of 1923. On the streets of Berlin, a woman pushes a wheelbarrow. Not to a market, not to a construction site. She is pushing it to a bakery. And inside the wheelbarrow, pressed in tight, stacked in bricks, is cash. It takes 100 billion marks to buy a single loaf of bread. Children play with bundles of banknotes on street corners, not because their parents are wealthy, but because the notes are worth less than the paper they are printed on. Factory workers are paid twice a day so they can spend their wages before the next hour erases their value. An egg costs what a mansion cost 3 years prior. Germany is in freefall, and somewhere in the Ruhr Valley, in a private rail car moving between mines, steel works, and newspaper offices, Hugo Stinnes is making the deal of his life. What you are about to hear is not a story about a villain. It is something more unsettling than that. Hugo Stinnes never broke a law. He never bribed a minister, never ordered a worker shot, never falsified a document. He simply understood something that almost no one else in Europe understood in time, that when a currency collapses, debt becomes a weapon. He borrowed in marks. He bought real things, coal, ships, forests, printing presses. And when the marks turned to dust, he kept the real things. By 1923, Hugo Stinnes controlled more of Germany's industrial economy than any single person in the history of the country. He was not a banker. He was not a politician. He was a mining engineer from Mülheim who had simply been paying very close attention. Hugo Stinnes was born in 1870 into a family that already understood coal. His grandfather had founded a trading company in the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland of Germany. And by the time Hugo inherited control of the firm in his mid-20s, he had already spent years descending into mines, walking factory floors, studying every link in the supply chain with the obsessive focus of a man who believed that information was the only real currency. By 1900, Stinnes had done something unusual. He had not simply expanded the family coal business. He had begun building vertical integration on a scale that Germany had never seen. He did not just want to mine coal. He wanted to own the ships that transported it, the steel mills that consumed it, the electricity plants that ran on it. He wanted to own the entire chain from extraction to end use, so that at no point in the process did money leave his control. His competitors thought this was reckless overreach. Bankers called it megalomaniacal. They were wrong. By the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, Stinnes was already one of the wealthiest men in Germany. But the war did something interesting. Germany, like all the major powers, needed to finance its military machine, and it chose to do so not through taxation but through borrowing. The government printed money, issued war bonds, made promises it could not keep. Stinnes bought those bonds, not because he believed in them, but because he understood that the men who issued them would owe favors to the men who bought them. And in the chaos of post-war Germany, favors were the most durable asset of all. When the war ended in 1918, Germany was broken. The Kaiser was gone. The Weimar Republic was born into a country that had lost its colonies, a third of its industrial territory, and its international credit standing. Reparations demanded by the Treaty of Versailles were set at figures so enormous that modern economists still debate whether they were designed to cripple rather than compensate. The mark began to slide, and Hugo Stinnes began to buy. Between 1919 and 1923, Stinnes executed one of the most audacious accumulation strategies in the history of capitalism. The logic was almost elegant in its simplicity. The German government, drowning in reparations debt denominated in foreign currency, was printing marks at an accelerating rate. The mark's value against the dollar fell from roughly 4 to 1 in 1914 to 4.2 trillion to 1 by November 1923. Stinnes borrowed marks, enormous quantities of them, and he spent those marks immediately on real assets: coal mines in the Ruhr, steamships on the Rhine, timber forests in Austria, hotels in Berlin, newspapers across a dozen cities, paper mills, electrical utilities. At the peak, estimates placed his holdings at over 1,500 separate business entities. The critical maneuver was this: when his loans came due, he repaid them in marks that were worth, by that point, essentially nothing. He had borrowed real money and repaid in confetti. The banks that had lent to him were legally satisfied, and Stinnes kept the assets. This was not secret. German economists wrote about it. Newspapers, including some that Stinnes himself now owned, described the process in detail. The Reichstag debated it. And yet it continued. Why? Because the alternative, confronting the men who held Germany's industrial infrastructure together while the political system convulsed, seemed more dangerous than tolerating the transfer of wealth. Stinnes employed hundreds of thousands of workers. His mines kept the lights on. His ships moved the goods. In a country where every institution was under strain, he had become an institution. He even entered politics. In 1920, Stinnes won a seat in the Reichstag as a member of the German People's Party. He used the position less to legislate than to negotiate blocking reparations agreements he found unfavorable, positioning himself as a semi-official voice of German industry in conversations with Allied representatives. There were men in London and Paris who dealt with Hugo Stinnes before they dealt with the German government. But in the background, something was shifting. In late 1923, under pressure from the Allies and from the complete breakdown of domestic commerce, Germany introduced the Rentenmark, a new currency backed not by gold, but by a mortgage on all German agricultural and industrial land. The hyperinflation stopped, almost overnight, with a precision that shocked economists. One Rentenmark was worth 1 trillion old marks. The wheelbarrows disappeared from the streets. The bakeries priced their bread in numbers a human being could comprehend again. For most Germans, this was salvation. For Hugo Stinnes, it was the beginning of the end. The empire Stinnes had built was, in a very precise sense, made of inflation. The strategy that had created it, borrow in soft currency, buy hard assets, repay in worthless paper, required one condition to keep working: the currency had to keep falling. The moment it stabilized, the debt remained but the arbitrage disappeared, and Stinnes had borrowed enormously. With a stable mark, his holding company faced real obligations in real money. The 1,000-plus businesses he controlled were not, as it turned out, all profitable on their own terms. Many had been acquired not for their earnings but for their strategic position in the chain. They consumed capital. They required management. They needed investment he no longer had the financial alchemy to produce. Stinnes saw this. His private correspondence from late 1923 reveals a man working 18-hour days, moving between creditors, restructuring loans, selling peripheral assets to defend core ones. He had always been physically imposing. Observers described him as barrel-chested, relentless, with the stamina of a man 20 years younger. But in the spring of 1924, Hugo Stinnes checked into a Berlin clinic complaining of gallbladder pain. The surgery on April 10, 1924, was routine. He was 54 years old. He did not survive it. The cause of death was listed as post-operative complications. Whatever the precise medical truth, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Stinnes empire had no succession plan. Hugo had accumulated power so personally, so completely, that without him at the center, negotiating, maneuvering, holding contradictory creditors in careful tension, the whole structure began to list. Within months, the holding company's debts became visible in ways they had never been during his lifetime. Creditors who had extended terms out of respect or fear, for Stinnes began calling in their obligations. Assets were sold at distressed prices. Subsidiaries were spun off, closed, or absorbed by rivals. By 1925, barely 18 months after his death, the largest private industrial empire in German history had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent entity. The newspapers wrote about it, some with shock, some with a quiet satisfaction that wealth built on paper had returned to paper. Hugo Stinnes left behind a ruined estate, a family with no financial foundation, and a country that had already moved on to its next crisis and its next strongman. There is a word that gets used about Hugo Stinnes in the economic literature: Inflationsgewinner. In German, it means simply inflation winner. It is a category, not just a name, because Stinnes was not unique in his method. He was unique only in his scale. Across Weimar Germany, thousands of businessmen understood the same basic principle and applied it in smaller ways, acquiring property, factories, goods, while their neighbors' savings evaporated. The difference between Stinnes and the others was ambition. He did not just want to survive the chaos. He wanted to own it. And here is the thing that the history books rarely pause on long enough. He was not wrong. The strategy worked. For years, it worked perfectly. The empire was real. The coal came out of the ground. The ships moved on the water. The newspapers printed every morning. Hundreds of thousands of people drew wages from entities he controlled. The flaw was not in the acquisition. It was in the assumption that the conditions enabling the acquisition would last forever. Every era of financial distortion creates its Hugo Stinnes. Someone who sees the mechanism clearly, moves faster than the crowd, accumulates real assets while others hold paper, and builds something so large, so leveraged, so dependent on the continuation of the very instability it was born from, that when the system corrects, the correction takes them with it. We saw versions of this in 2008. In the years of zero interest rates that followed, when cheap borrowed money built empires in commercial real estate, in tech, in private equity, empires that looked like genius during the expansion, and revealed their true architecture only when the rate environment changed. The wheelbarrows are different now. The marks have different names. But the man in the private rail car doing the math, moving faster than governments can react, he is always there. The only question history ever asks is, what happens when the train stops?